The accidents started small and seemingly unconnected, scattered across Biloxi, Mississippi like puzzle pieces that nobody had thought to assemble until Detective Sarah Martinez received the anonymous phone call that would change everything. It was March 15, 2024, exactly 5 years after Billy Crawford had died of a heart attack in his prison cell, taking with him the secrets of Amanda Whitman's brutal murder and any hope the victim's family had of witnessing their mother's killer face true justice. Martinez had been reviewing Crawford's closed case file when the call came through at 2:17 p.m. "You need to look at what's happening to the Crawford family," the voice whispered, distorted by what sounded like a voice modifier app. "This isn't coincidence. This is revenge. And it's been going on for 5 years." The line went dead before Martinez could ask any questions, leaving her staring at a phone number that traced to a burner device purchased with cash at a convenience store in Jackson. What Detective Martinez would discover over the next 6 months would reveal how grief can metastasize into something far darker than sorrow, how a mother's murder can echo through generations like ripples in still water, and how the death of a killer doesn't always end the cycle of violence he set in motion. The systematic destruction of Billy Crawford's family had been orchestrated with the patience of someone who understood that true revenge isn't served hot. It's served methodically, precisely, and over years rather than moments. If you're following cases where justice takes forms that the legal system never intended, make sure you're subscribed, because what we uncovered about Michael Whitman's 5-year plan will challenge everything you believe about where the line between justice and vengeance truly lies. Michael Whitman had been 8 years old when his mother Amanda disappeared on that October night in 1986, too young to fully comprehend the magnitude of loss but old enough to understand that something fundamental had been torn from his world. For 38 years he had lived with questions that haunted his sleep and theories that consumed his waking hours, building his adult life around the hollow space where his mother's presence should have been. When Billy Crawford was finally arrested in August 2018, Michael had felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: hope. But hope can be a dangerous emotion when it's followed by disappointment, and Crawford's death from a massive coronary just 6 months into his life sentence had transformed Michael's relief into something far more corrosive. The man who had stolen his mother, destroyed his family, and evaded justice for nearly 4 decades had escaped the reckoning that Michael had spent his entire adult life anticipating. Crawford had died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by the medical care that Amanda had been denied during her final moments. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but rather through a series of small compromises and rationalized decisions that gradually eroded Michael's moral foundation until revenge seemed not just justified but necessary. The process began during the long nights following Crawford's death, when Michael found himself unable to sleep, consumed by fantasies of violence against people he had never met but who shared the killer's name and DNA. Initially, Michael tried to channel his rage through legitimate means, contacting victim advocacy groups and pushing for legislative changes that would prevent killers from escaping justice through natural death. He wrote letters to newspapers, spoke at conferences, and lobbied politicians for reforms that would ensure victims' families could find closure even when perpetrators died before completing their sentences. These efforts provided temporary relief but ultimately proved insufficient to satisfy the burning need for retribution that consumed his every waking moment. The funeral home in Biloxi where Crawford's body was prepared for burial became the starting point of Michael's metamorphosis from grieving son to calculating predator. He had driven to Morrison Funeral Home on the gray February morning when Crawford's viewing was scheduled, not to pay respects but to study the faces of people who had somehow found reasons to mourn a killer. The small gathering consisted primarily of Crawford's son David, his daughter-in-law Patricia, their 2 teenage children, and a handful of elderly neighbors who remembered Billy Crawford as the helpful handyman rather than the murderer. Michael sat in his car across the street, using a telephoto lens to photograph each mourner as they entered and exited the funeral home. The images would become the foundation of a database that he spent the following months expanding, researching the lives and routines of everyone who had shown Crawford's memory more compassion than he had ever shown Amanda. David Crawford worked as an insurance adjuster for State Farm, drove a silver Honda Accord, and lived in a modest ranch house on Magnolia Street with his family. Patricia Crawford taught 3rd grade at Beauregard Elementary School and volunteered at the local animal shelter on weekends. The research phase of Michael's plan consumed 8 months, during which he learned everything knowable about the Crawford family's daily routines, financial obligations, medical histories, and personal relationships. He created detailed files on each family member, mapping their movements with the same methodical precision that Crawford had once used to stalk his victims. Michael understood that random violence was the tool of amateurs, True revenge required intimate knowledge of the target's vulnerabilities and the patience to exploit those weaknesses systematically. Michael's apartment on Oak Street became a command center that would have impressed military strategists with its organization and attention to detail. Every wall was covered with photographs, timeline charts, and detailed maps marking the Crawford family's daily movements. He had installed multiple computer monitors that displayed surveillance footage from cameras he had secretly positioned around their neighborhood, creating a real-time intelligence network that allowed him to track their activities with unprecedented precision. The equipment required for this level of surveillance had cost Michael nearly $15,000, money he had withdrawn from his mother's life insurance policy, a bitter irony that wasn't lost on him. Hidden cameras, audio recording devices, GPS trackers, and sophisticated computer software transformed his modest apartment into a high-tech spy operation that would have been impossible for ordinary citizens to assemble just a decade earlier. Michael's day job as a computer systems analyst for a medical supply company provided both the technical skills and the legitimate reason to be knowledgeable about surveillance technology. His co-workers knew him as a quiet, competent professional who rarely socialized but always completed his assignments with meticulous attention to detail. None of them suspected that Michael was applying those same technical skills to a project far more sinister than hospital inventory management. The psychological profile that would later emerge during Michael's trial revealed a man whose intellectual capabilities had been weaponized by decades of unresolved trauma and whose moral reasoning had been corrupted by exposure to violence at a formative age. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the forensic psychiatrist who conducted extensive interviews with Michael, described his condition as complicated grief disorder with paranoid and antisocial features, a clinical diagnosis that barely captured the sophisticated evil that Michael had become capable of executing. The first incident occurred on October 15, 2019, exactly 33 years after Amanda's murder and precisely 1 year after Crawford's death. Patricia Crawford was driving home from her volunteer shift at the animal shelter when her brake line failed as she navigated the steep hill on Cemetery Road. The Honda's inability to stop sent it careening through the guardrail and down a 20-foot embankment, where it struck an oak tree with enough force to deploy the airbags and shatter the windshield. Patricia survived the crash with a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and a fractured collarbone, injuries that would require months of physical therapy and leave her with chronic pain that interfered with her ability to teach. The Mississippi Highway Patrol's investigation determined that the brake line had been severed by road debris, though they couldn't identify what specific object had caused the damage. The insurance company classified the incident as an unfortunate accident, processing Patricia's claim while recommending more frequent vehicle inspections for cars driven on rural roads. Michael had spent weeks studying Patricia's route home from the animal shelter, identifying the stretch of Cemetery Road where she would be most vulnerable to a brake failure. The modification to her vehicle had required less than 10 minutes with a small drill and some knowledge of automotive systems, skills he had acquired during years of maintaining his own car and researching mechanical sabotage techniques through online forums and technical manuals. The crash had been designed to injure rather than kill, the first movement in a symphony of suffering that would crescendo over the following years. The precision required for the brake line sabotage had demanded extensive research into automotive engineering and careful timing to ensure that the failure would occur at the most dangerous possible moment. Michael had studied Patricia's driving patterns for months, identifying the exact point where brake failure would create maximum danger while appearing to be a random mechanical malfunction. The technique required drilling a nearly invisible hole in the brake line that would gradually weaken under pressure until catastrophic failure occurred at the worst possible moment. Michael's journals from this period revealed the satisfaction he derived from watching news coverage of Patricia's accident and reading the family's social media posts about their confusion and fear. He wrote extensively about the pleasure of knowing that the Crawford family was experiencing the same helplessness and terror that had defined his own childhood, though they had no idea that their suffering was being deliberately orchestrated by someone who had studied their routines with predatory patience. 6 months later, David Crawford experienced his own brush with mechanical misfortune when the ladder he was using to clean his gutters collapsed beneath him, sending him tumbling 12 feet onto the concrete driveway. The aluminum ladder's support mechanisms had been weakened with precise cuts that weren't visible to casual inspection but created structural failure under normal weight loads. David's fall resulted in a shattered ankle that required surgery and 3 months of disability leave from his job at State Farm. The ladder sabotage had been even more technically challenging than the brake line modification, requiring Michael to study structural engineering principles and metallurgy to understand exactly how to weaken the support mechanisms without creating obvious evidence of tampering. He had practiced the technique on dozens of ladders purchased from hardware stores, testing various methods of creating delayed failure until he perfected an approach that would appear to be normal wear and tear rather than deliberate sabotage. The pattern continued with carefully orchestrated incidents that appeared unrelated to anyone not looking for connections. The Crawford family's youngest child, 16-year-old Emma, developed severe food poisoning after eating lunch at school, an illness that hospitalized her for 4 days and left lasting digestive problems that would plague her through her senior year. The contamination source was never identified, though Michael had introduced a measured dose of Salmonella bacteria into Emma's favorite energy drink using techniques learned through his research into biological warfare methods. Michael's study of biological weapons had been particularly disturbing, involving months of research into bacteriology, toxicology, and infectious disease transmission. He had cultivated Salmonella cultures in a makeshift laboratory in his apartment's spare bathroom, using equipment purchased through legitimate scientific supply companies and techniques learned from microbiology textbooks. The precision required to create illness without causing death had demanded extensive experimentation and careful calculation of dosage levels. Detective Martinez's investigation into the Crawford family's string of misfortunes began when the anonymous caller provided specific dates and details that suggested intimate knowledge of each incident. The caller had described Patricia's brake failure, David's ladder collapse, Emma's food poisoning, and several other accidents that hadn't been reported to police but were documented in hospital records and insurance claims. The precision of the information suggested either extensive surveillance or direct involvement in orchestrating the events. The breakthrough came when Martinez cross-referenced the Crawford family incidents with Michael Whitman's location data, obtained through a court order that allowed examination of his cell phone records. The geographic tracking revealed that Michael's phone had been in proximity to each accident site in the hours or days preceding every incident. His device had pinged cell towers near Patricia's route home before her brake failure, near David's house before the ladder collapse, and near Emma's school before her food poisoning. Michael's transformation from grief-stricken son to systematic predator had been gradual but inexorable, shaped by 38 years of unanswered questions and a justice system that had seemed incapable of delivering the resolution he craved. The death of his mother when he was 8 had created a void that he had tried to fill through various means throughout his adult life: therapy, support groups, advocacy work for victims' families, but nothing had provided the closure that he needed to move forward. The therapy sessions that Michael had attended sporadically over the years had actually contributed to his ability to manipulate and deceive others, teaching him to recognize psychological vulnerabilities and understand how to exploit emotional weaknesses. Dr. Richard Hayes, one of Michael's former therapists, would later testify that Michael had been an unusually sophisticated patient who seemed more interested in learning therapeutic techniques than in processing his own trauma. Crawford's arrest in 2018 had represented the culmination of everything Michael had hoped for during 4 decades of waiting. The DNA evidence was irrefutable, the confession was detailed, and justice seemed finally within reach. Michael had attended every court hearing, every procedural meeting, every moment of Crawford's legal reckoning, building his identity around the anticipated satisfaction of watching his mother's killer spend his remaining years in prison. The heart attack that killed Crawford 6 months into his sentence had shattered that carefully constructed sense of meaning, leaving Michael with nothing but rage and a detailed knowledge of how the Crawford family lived their daily lives. The research he had conducted in preparation for impact statements and victim advocacy had given him intimate insight into the people who shared Crawford's name and DNA, and gradually that knowledge had evolved from academic interest into something far more sinister. The psychological evaluation that would later be conducted during Michael's trial revealed a man whose capacity for empathy had been eroded by decades of unresolved trauma and whose moral framework had been corrupted by exposure to violence at a formative age. The expert testimony described how witnessing his mother's disappearance as a child had created what psychologists term frozen grief, an inability to process loss that manifested as persistent fantasies of revenge and control. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic psychiatrist who examined Michael, testified that his systematic campaign against the Crawford family represented a displaced attempt to complete the justice process that Crawford's death had interrupted. Mr. Whitman had structured his entire adult identity around the anticipation of witnessing his mother's killer face consequences, she explained to the court. When that opportunity was taken away, he created his own form of consequences, targeting people he perceived as extensions of the man who had destroyed his family. The escalation of Michael's campaign became evident as Detective Martinez pieced together 5 years of incidents that had grown progressively more dangerous and psychologically sophisticated. The early accidents had been designed to cause injury and inconvenience, but later incidents showed evidence of planning that extended months in advance and demonstrated increasingly detailed knowledge of his target's psychological vulnerabilities as well as their physical routines. David Crawford's son Marcus, a promising high school athlete with scholarship potential, began experiencing panic attacks during basketball games that ended his athletic career and damaged his college prospects. The attacks were triggered by specific sounds: the squeak of gym shoes on hardwood floors, the bounce of basketballs, that had been conditioned through months of psychological manipulation that Martinez would later trace to Michael's presence at games and practices. The conditioning process had involved Michael attending Marcus's games and subtly introducing stress-inducing stimuli at key moments, creating associations between normal basketball sounds and feelings of anxiety and dread. The technique required extensive knowledge of behavioral psychology and represented a level of sophistication that suggested Michael had been studying psychological warfare methods with the same intensity he had once devoted to following his mother's case. The methods Michael used to condition Marcus's panic responses were based on classical conditioning principles that he had learned through extensive study of behavioral psychology textbooks and research papers. He would attend basketball games carrying a small device that emitted subsonic frequencies designed to create feelings of unease and anxiety, timing the emissions to coincide with specific game sounds until Marcus's nervous system learned to associate those sounds with stress and fear. Patricia Crawford's classroom at Beauregard Elementary became the site of increasingly disturbing incidents that undermined her effectiveness as a teacher and created a hostile work environment that forced her to take extended medical leave. Her students began finding dead insects in their desks, receiving anonymous notes with disturbing content, and experiencing equipment failures that seemed designed to maximize chaos and anxiety during critical learning activities. The classroom incidents required Michael to infiltrate the school's security systems and gain access to areas that were supposed to be restricted to staff members. He accomplished this by volunteering for after-school programs and weekend maintenance activities, gradually building relationships with custodial staff and administrators who trusted him enough to provide access to keys and security codes. The psychological impact on the Crawford children proved to be Michael's most effective weapon, as their parents watched helplessly while Emma and Marcus developed symptoms of chronic stress that interfered with their ability to function normally in school and social situations. Both teenagers required therapy and medication to cope with anxiety disorders that seemed to worsen despite professional intervention and family support. Michael's methods became more sophisticated as he studied his target's responses to stress and adjusted his tactics accordingly. He learned that Emma was particularly sensitive to social media harassment, while Marcus was more vulnerable to academic pressure and fears about his athletic performance. Patricia's teaching career provided numerous opportunities for sabotage that could be disguised as student pranks or equipment malfunctions. The social media harassment campaign against Emma required Michael to create dozens of fake accounts and develop sophisticated techniques for avoiding detection by platform security systems. He studied her online behavior patterns and social relationships to identify the most effective ways to create psychological distress while maintaining plausible deniability about his involvement. The investigation revealed that Michael had been documenting his campaign through detailed journals that recorded not only his actions but also his target's reactions and his own psychological state throughout the process. The journals showed a man who had become addicted to the sense of power and control that his secret campaign provided, gradually losing sight of his original motivation as the process of inflicting suffering became its own reward. Entry after entry revealed Michael's growing satisfaction with his ability to manipulate the Crawford family's lives from the shadows, creating problems that they couldn't solve and stresses that they couldn't understand or escape. He wrote extensively about the pleasure he derived from watching David struggle to make insurance claims for increasingly bizarre accidents, and Patricia's growing paranoia about whether someone was deliberately targeting her family. The journals also revealed the extent of Michael's surveillance operation, which had evolved from simple observation to active infiltration of the Crawford family's social and professional circles. He had befriended neighbors, co-workers, and even family friends, using these relationships to gather intelligence about upcoming events, emotional vulnerabilities, and opportunities for sabotage. Michael's ability to maintain these relationships while secretly orchestrating attacks against the Crawford family demonstrated a level of compartmentalization and deception that impressed even experienced criminal psychologists. He had created an entire false persona as a concerned community member who was always ready to help his neighbors, while simultaneously using that access to gather information that he would later use to cause them harm. The community relationships that Michael cultivated required him to become accomplished at reading people's emotional states and understanding what they needed to hear to trust him. He volunteered at the local food bank, participated in neighborhood watch programs, and even donated money to the Crawford children's school activities, all while planning increasingly sophisticated attacks on their family. The breaking point came in March 2024 when Michael's plans escalated from psychological torture and minor physical harm to something approaching attempted murder. Emma Crawford had been accepted to the University of Southern Mississippi on an academic scholarship that represented her family's hope for breaking the cycle of misfortune that had plagued them for 5 years. Michael's response was to orchestrate an incident that would eliminate her educational opportunity and potentially end her life. The gas leak in Emma's bedroom was designed to create a slow accumulation of carbon monoxide that would cause permanent brain damage rather than immediate death, ensuring that even if she survived, her academic potential would be destroyed. The modification to the heating system required breaking into the Crawford house and making precise adjustments that would create danger while appearing to be the result of normal equipment failure. The technical knowledge required for the gas leak modification had taken Michael months to acquire, involving study of heating systems, gas flow dynamics, and the effects of carbon monoxide poisoning on human physiology. He had practiced the technique on heating systems in abandoned houses, testing various methods of creating delayed gas leaks until he perfected an approach that would be virtually undetectable by normal inspection. Detective Martinez's surveillance of Michael had reached the point where officers were able to intercept him as he left the Crawford property after installing the gas leak device. The arrest occurred at 2:47 a.m. on March 18, 2024, exactly 5 years and 1 day after Crawford's death in prison. Michael offered no resistance when officers approached him, simply nodding and extending his hands for handcuffs as if he had been expecting this moment for some time. The evidence recovered from Michael's house painted a picture of obsession that had consumed every aspect of his adult life. In addition to the detailed journals documenting his 5-year campaign against the Crawford family, investigators found extensive files on other families of convicted criminals, suggesting that Michael's revenge fantasy extended far beyond the people who shared his mother's killer's name. Maps of Biloxi and surrounding areas were marked with locations of potential targets, while technical manuals on explosives, poisons, and surveillance equipment revealed the depth of Michael's commitment to developing skills that would make him a more effective predator. Photographs of Crawford family members covered an entire wall of his spare bedroom, with detailed notes about their schedules, habits, and psychological profiles. The most disturbing discovery was a detailed timeline that extended several more years into the future, showing that Michael had planned to continue his campaign until every member of the Crawford family was either dead or had suffered enough trauma to satisfy his need for revenge. The plan included provisions for targeting Emma and Marcus's future spouses and children, creating a multi-generational cycle of suffering that would echo his mother's murder through decades of calculated cruelty. Michael's confession to Detective Martinez was delivered with the same methodical precision that had characterized his revenge campaign. He showed no remorse for the pain he had inflicted on the Crawford family, describing his actions as necessary steps in completing the justice process that the legal system had failed to provide. His only regret, he explained, was that Billy Crawford had died before witnessing the destruction of his family. "He took everything from me when I was 8 years old," Michael told Martinez during his videotaped confession. "My mother, my childhood, my ability to trust the world or believe that good things happen to good people. I spent 38 years waiting for justice, and when it finally came, he escaped before paying the real price. His family needed to understand what it felt like to lose everything the way mine did." The trial that followed revealed the extent of Michael's psychological damage and raised difficult questions about where personal responsibility begins and ends for someone whose capacity for normal emotional development had been destroyed by childhood trauma. The defense argued that Michael's actions, while inexcusable, were the predictable result of a system that had failed to provide adequate support for victims' families or ensure that justice was actually served. The prosecution countered that Michael's intelligence and sophistication in planning his revenge demonstrated that he understood the difference between right and wrong, regardless of his psychological damage. The systematic nature of his campaign and his ability to maintain normal relationships while secretly inflicting suffering on innocent people showed a level of calculation that went beyond trauma response into deliberate criminal behavior. The Crawford family's victim impact statements provided heartbreaking testimony about how 5 years of mysterious accidents and psychological torture had destroyed their sense of security and trust in the world around them. Patricia described panic attacks that prevented her from sleeping, while David explained how he had become suspicious of every neighbor and co-worker, wondering whether they might be secretly working to harm his family. Emma and Marcus, now in their early 20s, described childhoods that had been stolen by an adult's need for revenge against their grandfather's crimes. Both had developed chronic anxiety disorders and struggled with depression that interfered with their ability to form normal relationships or pursue their educational and career goals. "We never even knew our grandfather," Emma testified. "We were just children when he was arrested, and we were horrified to learn what he had done. We felt sorry for his victims and their families. We never imagined that one of those family members would decide that we deserved to suffer for crimes we had nothing to do with." Judge Patricia Morrison's sentencing remarks reflected the complexity of a case that challenged conventional understanding of justice, revenge, and personal responsibility. She acknowledged Michael's genuine trauma while emphasizing that his response had created new trauma for people who bore no responsibility for his mother's death. "Mr. Whitman," she said, addressing Michael directly, "your mother's murder was a terrible crime that stole your childhood and shaped your entire life in ways that no child should have to endure. But your response to that trauma has created new victims, new trauma, and new cycles of pain that will echo through the Crawford family for generations." The life sentence without possibility of parole that Judge Morrison imposed on Michael Whitman reflected both the severity of his crimes and the understanding that his psychological damage was too extensive for rehabilitation to be realistic. The systematic nature of his campaign and the sophistication of his methods demonstrated a level of dangerousness that made his eventual release impossible to consider. The Crawford family's reaction to Michael's sentencing was complex, mixing relief with sadness for a man whose life had been destroyed by circumstances beyond his control when he was still a child. They expressed hope that his imprisonment would prevent other families from experiencing the kind of terror they had endured, while acknowledging that true healing would require years of continued therapy and support. Detective Martinez's final report on the case highlighted how crimes can echo through generations in ways that traditional law enforcement isn't equipped to anticipate or prevent. Michael's systematic revenge campaign had required skills and knowledge that he had acquired specifically to harm people who had never wronged him, demonstrating how grief can metastasize into something far more dangerous than simple sorrow. The case became a teaching example for law enforcement agencies about the importance of monitoring the families of high-profile criminals and maintaining awareness of how public cases might inspire copycat behavior or revenge fantasies in people whose own trauma makes them vulnerable to violent ideation. As we conclude this investigation into how a son's quest for justice became a 5-year campaign of terror against innocent people, we want to hear your thoughts about where the line between justice and revenge should be drawn. Do you think Michael Whitman's actions were understandable given what he had endured as a child? Or do you believe that personal trauma can never justify harming innocent people? Share your theories in the comments below. Subscribe to stay updated on cases where the boundaries between victim and perpetrator become blurred, and hit the notification bell so you never miss when we explore the complex psychology behind crimes that challenge our understanding of justice and personal responsibility.